Hello, Kevin here with another episode of the Can't Make This Up History podcast. I'd like to say welcome to any new listeners and welcome back to any old listeners. So what makes a genius? Perhaps someone who can memorize endless facts or maybe sees the world in an entirely original way? Who are some people that you would consider to be a genius? Maybe Leonardo DaVinci, Mary Shelley, or Albert Einstein. Would you say that geniuses are born or are they made? Are you, in fact, a genius? These are all questions that my guest today has given considerable thought to. Craig Wright is Professor Emeritus of Music at Yale University, and during his professorship, he developed a course called Exploring the Nature of Genius that has become quite popular among Yale's undergraduates. Craig has distilled his research for that course into his new book, The Hidden Habits of Genius: Beyond Talent, IQ, and Grit, Unlocking the Secrets of Greatness. In this episode, Craig and I discuss exactly what the term genius means. We explore some common misconceptions of genius, and we talk about some notable geniuses throughout history. This is going to be a fun episode. Before we get into it though, I want to give a shout out to my Finnish listeners. That's right, I've discovered that I have a fairly sizable audience in Finland, so I just wanted to say hello to you. And I also want to give a shout out for a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you very much to Podcaster204 for their 5-star review. Podcaster204 says, "Love this podcast. Absolutely loves history and was extremely happy to find a show that treats history in such a unique and entertaining way." Well, thank you so much, and I'm so glad that you enjoy it. If you've been listening for a while and you like listening to the podcast, consider throwing a review up on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. Those things are really helpful, both in attracting new people to listen to the show, but also they're very encouraging for me as well. It's nice to know that you guys are enjoying the work that I'm doing here at the podcast. Of course, if you want to stay connected when we're off air not doing an episode, I'm on Twitter and Instagram at CMTU History. You'll also find me on Facebook by the same name as well. And if you would like to get a little extra out of your podcast experience, head on over to the show's Patreon page. On our Patreon, I have a little extra bonus Q&A with the show guests. Craig and I, we talk about this topic of greatness and how it fits into the education system of today. How do we treat so-called gifted kids? So if you want to check that out, head over to the show's Patreon page and consider supporting the podcast. All right, that's it. Let's dive into today's show.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools, and stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
Hi, Craig Wright. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Well, thank you for being on. Today we're gonna talk about your new book coming out here in October, The Hidden Habits of Genius: Beyond Talent, IQ, and Grit, Unlocking the Secrets of Greatness. I feel like I could use a little bit of this in my life.
Yeah, me too. That's it's ironic that, and my children think that this is profoundly ironic that I, of all people, the ultimate plotter, am writing a book on genius. So, in terms of truth in advertising here, I am no genius. But maybe it takes a non-genius to watch geniuses and to think about genius.
All right. Well, if you could, genius aside, tell us a little bit about your background. Where do you come from?
It came from everywhere because this was after World War II. So my father, who was still in the military at the end of that, we were moving around a lot. At age 18, I had a scholarship to play golf at the University of Maryland, but other kids were already beating me, so I figured that wasn't going to work out. I also had a small scholarship to the Eastman School of Music to become the next Van Cliburn. I pursued that and actually got a degree from there, but I found out one sobering fact while I was there, and that is that I had actually very little musical talent, which is a real liability if you want to be a performing musician. So I think the mantra there was, if you can't compose and you can't perform, well, maybe you can teach. So off to Harvard I went to get a PhD in what was called musicology. I enjoyed that very much. And then I got a job teaching at Yale, teaching the 3 B's of classical music, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and stayed there very happily for 44 years until I recently retired.
So this idea of genius, how did you come onto this topic? From reading your book, it sounds like you taught a course on this.
Yeah, I got started, of the 3 B's in music, it was actually an M, Mozart, that began to interest me most. And I think many people got interested in Mozart because of this film. Brilliant, brilliant film. Won 12 Academy Awards. I don't think any film's ever surpassed that. Amadeus. Go watch that. It is just still spectacular because it's all done in period costume and it hasn't aged a bit. In any event, everybody was talking about Mozart then. I started reading about Mozart. I said, wow, this is amazing. The astonishing thing with Mozart is that you have about 1,200 letters going back and forth. It's like you have all of Mozart's text messages. So he's talking about what he's feeling that particular day, what he's eating that particular day, what his sexual desires are that particular day, what his artistic interests are, what he thinks of this or that composer. It's really quite fascinating. It's a gold mine of opening up a window on somebody's mind. So I started working with Mozart, and then one summer I spent 3 weeks in Florence. I started rooting around in the notebooks of Leonardo DaVinci and said, wow, this is interesting because there's so many commonalities here. They're both kind of funny and iconoclastic, irreverent in their approach to their superiors, rebellious, independent mindset. So maybe are in fact, as I say, commonalities between these famous people. Maybe many geniuses had the same. And then off I went, but I had to learn something about the sciences. But it helps to be at a place like Yale because you have generous colleagues, other faculty members who will teach you. So it started to build on there, constructed a course around these geniuses, and off it went for about 15 years until I retired. Actually, though, I still teach that course annually in an online basis during the summer.
Okay, and I'm sure you've observed with your students, I know that I came into this with these preconceived notions of just what on earth a genius is. So let's break that down. What are we talking about when we use the term genius?
Very, very good question, because it's one of those words we use almost every day and nobody ever defines it. Even you look in dictionaries and you get only the lamest explanation for what a genius is. We could talk about it over history. Back in the day with ancient Greeks, for example, they had an idea much like Walt Disney's Aladdin, where the genie is something that sits on your shoulder and he can do good or bad things for you in the coming year. Kevin, here's a question for you. Have you had a birthday recently?
It's been a few months, but yeah.
Did anybody make a cake for you, or is there a cake in front of you at any point with a candle on it?
Red velvet cake every year.
With candle, or?
Yep.
Okay, so, and did you make a wish?
I did.
And blow out the candle. Well, next time you do that, remember that this particular ritual is at least 2.5 millennia old. You are making a votive offering to your genius, who sits on your genie, who sits on your shoulder, asking that genie to do really great things for you in the coming year. That's what it's all about. So genius was thought to be an outside external force up into the 18th century, the Enlightenment, when then it shifted. The genie, who was subsumed by God during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, gave way to the humanistic individual. The genius is now inside of the individual. It's up to you to do great things. If you do great things, you have the right to those great things. Intellectual property, the whole notion of that comes into play. Copyright, this is all part part of the mindset of the Enlightenment. Then things get a little bit crazy as we go into the 19th century with the genius as being a loner, a misanthrope, perhaps somewhat deranged, that has these brilliant slap on the forehead, aha moments. And that, in a way, is what we still have. There's a vestige of that approach, that understanding of genius today, except it's interesting to note, and I'm going on here too long, but it's interesting to note with this concurrent pandemic, and we need a genius to rescue us here, a salvation figure. But it's when you hear what's happening, they're talking about Moderna and AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, these chemical companies. Nobody's talking about where's the genius there in that company. It's the genius of the team. So maybe with regard to science and technology today, the notion of the genius is shifting over away from a solitary individual to a group enterprise. Was Einstein, in fact, the last solitary genius in the sciences?
When I was in grad school, I took a course on science policy, and we talked about something called big science, where basically, science and projects like that are so large now. The idea that one guy, a Thomas Edison or a Nikola Tesla, working in their lab, they can't do it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's what's happening is there's just so much to control for. I mean, you go back to the day of Einstein, and even Einstein in his day, they would have the Solvay conferences annually, and this was in Belgium. And all of the great minds, Poincaré, Rutherford, Marie Curie, would show up, Max Planck would show up, and they would talk about what's happening in science and physics and so on. So even back then there was a kind of collaborative effort going on, but it's only expanded and exploded into scientific labs with many hundreds, indeed perhaps thousands of people working in them at the moment.
So, what's your criteria for the book? What's your working definition of genius for the
Well,
people that you profile?
Well, that's a tricky question. That's actually the first paper assignment for the kids in my genius class is to write a paper, very simply, what is genius? It's harder than you would think. So you can come up with different long-winded explanations, but let me give you a definition that sort of cuts to the chase. Actually, I got on this, now that I think of it, by something that Elon Musk said about genius at one point. But building on that, here's my definition of genius, and it is an equation, almost a mathematical equation. G equals S times N times D. So what the heck does all that mean? Well, genius equals significance times number of people impacted by that significance times the duration of the impact. So if we take something, to exemplify how this might work, if we take something like Fleming's discovery of penicillin. Now, penicillin is hugely important. It saves lives, estimated to save 200 million lives over time. That I would posit is a more significant event than Kanye West, who's a very interesting character, a very interesting creative artist. Kanye West's latest design for a tennis shoe. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say penicillin is more important than the latest design for a tennis shoe. So that's what the significance. The number of people already referenced here, more than 200 million lives saved. Maybe only 1,000 people buy this new kind of tennis shoe, but 200 million have been impacted by the advent of penicillin, and ultimately for how long? I mean, how long is a tennis shoe going to stay in vogue or in style? Whereas these antibiotics, as represented by penicillin, have now been with this for 80 years. So again, as I say, genius equals significance times number impacted times duration of the impact.
And so what this opens you up to is not simply just a genius in, say, the sciences, but it opens up to the arts and to the political sphere and the civic sphere.
Yeah, right. And it should. Because I mean, Abraham Lincoln, who's a pretty astonishing person, actually. Been reading a couple biographies of Lincoln of late. Lincoln's an astonishing person, and he's even more astonishing when you look at political discourse today. You look at political thought. You look at public morality. Private morality is represented by politicians. It's astonishing. I thought the world was supposed to get better. So that's a real eye opener, and it does extend. Genius does extend to people like Mahatma Gandhi and obviously Martin Luther King, who has great importance and relevance even today. Political figures, Churchill, Angela Merkel in Germany, hugely impressive, I think, and the aforementioned Abraham Lincoln. So it extends not only through science and technology, but also into the arts and the political sciences as well.
Okay, so the first thing you try to tackle in your book is just, where does it come from? Is it something that we're born with? Is it something that you can teach somebody? What have been the historical attempts to understand where this comes from?
Well, this takes us back to the old nature versus nurture argument, which is now about 170 years old. And it is, it's not nature and nurture, it's genetics versus your environment. Now, in the course of my book, I say that there are a number of habits of genius, these hidden habits of genius. And among them, I would say curiosity, passion, in a visionary imagination, perhaps being comfortable with outsider status, being a rebel of some sort, self-confidence, and on we go. So I'm going to kick this back to you, Kevin. What do you think? Let's take curiosity. Do you think curiosity is something you're born with, or can you make yourself curious over time? Did you ever take a course in curiosity while you were in school?
I never did take a class in curiosity, but I took several classes that made me curious. I will say that some of the best teachers prompted me to want to go further and get curious about things.
Well, I would say that, and one of the things people ask me, okay, so these are important things about genius. What's not important about genius? The thing that's not important about genius is IQ. Having a very high IQ. Oh, the genius is a brainiac with an IQ of over 140 or something like this. It can do these computations quickly in the head and score a great score on the SAT test or the ACT test, whatever it is. I think that's overrated. What's not overrated is curiosity. And it seems, in retrospect, looking back on this, curious to me, or odd to me, that there are not courses in curiosity somewhere in a curriculum. I think from what I've read, it is a large part genetic, that people are to some degree born curious. And in my personal experience, I think that probably was true. I have now 4 children and 7 grandchildren, so I'm watching all of this. And I think some of it is innate and some of it is genetic. But by the same token, I think there are many things that you can do to stimulate your own curiosity. They're probably obvious, but I think there are things that you can do. So curiosity, and maybe most of these hidden habits of genius, are to a degree and perhaps a large measure self-regulating or self-regulatory. You can take charge. You can do it yourself.
So you see it as kind of a blend of the two. There's no real magic formula
Kevin,
to make it.
I may even stop you here, because I have there's a passage in this book. I don't know if you happen to take a look at chapter 1 where the United States best figure skater, #1 figure skater, Nathan Chen, won a gold medal in the Olympics. He talks about nature versus nurture in terms of figure skating. And I've talked with him. Nathan, you're still a student. Is it okay if I reference you and take what you said? He took this genius class. So I've talked with him about this. And he has interesting things to say about nature versus nurture from the point of view of somebody that's won an Olympic medal, maybe. And he's the guy that was the first to do these four circular twists, jump, cycles or whatever you call those things.
I found one thing that I found interesting in reading this is that the idea of genius also extends to athletics.
Well, I think it can extend to athletics if the athlete is so extraordinary, like Simone Biles, for example, or like Nathan Chen, who I could elaborate on here in a moment, is so exceptional that they require a new scale of judging to come into the game, or there's a new term for what they decide to do creatively, and then everybody else begins to imitate that. And that's what we mean by impact and change. The scoring process has changed. What other skaters do has changed. So let me read you what a student in my genius class said about this. This student happens to be the United States, America's #1 ranked male figure skater at the moment. He's already won an Olympic gold medal. His activities are on hold at the moment. So as part of the discussions back and forth between the two of us in class, this is what he said about genius. Okay, in my opinion, there are genetic factors at work in this domain. Height, body proportions, general strength, and the capacity to quickly improve muscle memory. But there are, in addition, a number of genetic factors you can't really see and are more difficult to quantify. Among these are the ability to be calm in the face of stress and the ability to internally strategize and course correct in a competition. Hey, that's interesting. I suppose that's true. If you get very nervous, that's probably a genetic issue, stress. And this whole idea about being so in the frame, so mindful that you could course correct during a competition. Can you imagine doing one of these twists on the ice and, I'm going too fast, or I shouldn't. That's requires a great deal of self-control. Okay, back to Nathan. So for me, I would say that it is 80% nature. You say, a lot of this is just natural gifts. The gold medal athletes get to the accumulated 100%. In other words, 80% nature, genes and luck, plus 20% nurture. For those athletes who are naturally at 60%, nature at 60%, they must maximize the 20% work in order to even think about competing at the top, the 90 to 100% athletes. Therefore, it's difficult to say which is more important, nature or nurture. They both have their importance, but at the end of the day, no matter how hard you train in your sport, without that genetic capacity, it will be nearly impossible to be the best. So he's leaning on the side of nature there, that it's genetic.
Well, and as you mentioned, this is a 150 plus year debate that is going to continue, no doubt.
Yeah, it will continue because we don't know the answer. And the answer is not quantifiable. We can't reduce curiosity down to a percentage to say, okay, this is 41%. And those psychologists have tried to do this. People writing articles about this to say that it's 40, your output is 41% genetic with regard to curiosity and 59% environment. But that seems to be taking this into the theater of the absurd.
So when you were doing research into this topic, it seems like one of the possible traps to fall into is that this becomes, what in history they would call great men theory, where you focus on prominent individuals, mostly men, who've shaped history. So how has gender bias really kind of historically limited the success of female geniuses?
Well, historically, genius has been, because it's not a quantifiable entity, it has been whatever people want to make of it. Is genius relative or is it absolute? I would say that it is relative. You could have a culture in which a particular group of people and their entire sphere of activity and life experience would be within that group. It could be a tribe in the Brazilian Amazon. It could be, say, in 19th or 20th century Navajo Indian tribe in the United States, in which their sphere of reference is very different than the Western world, and who their heroes are, who their geniuses are, is very different. And this allows us, I think each individual is allowed to craft a definition of his or her making, and it also points out the issue not only of the importance not to marginalize minority, so-called minority groups or the other, not to marginalize them, and not to marginalize half of the population of the planet, women. So by understanding that the only thing that's really absolute in life is change, and that our notion of what a genius is will be relevant to different groups at different points in history, will we come to understand, I think, a more realistic definition of it. But getting back to the question of women in particular, obviously they have been marginalized over time, and it's almost comical the way great minds over the millennia have treated women, even if they had to have more to get in the game, and then even if they were allowed to play in the game, suddenly the rules all change as the game is being played, so they are the losers. And it's been going on for a long period of time because history is written by men, and words are have historically been defined by men, words such as genius. So what a genius is has historically been defined by men. But as we all know, that is very much changing.
Absolutely, and you include a number of very interesting stories of women geniuses throughout the book.
Not as many not as many as I would like. What I learned from studying them is that they all have to have all of the hidden habits of genius. They have to have the same opportunity. They have to, which to a degree is luck. They have to have, as men do, they have to have the same degree of curiosity, same degree of passion, same degree of independent spirit, same visionary imagination. But at the same time, they need more of something, and that is persistence or grit. They need an extra dose of that just because they have to keep beating their heads against this barrier that precludes them from creating and precludes them from having their creative products recognized.
Now, when you talk about geniuses, one thing that might come to mind to people is the idea of the child prodigy. The genius was doing advanced math equations before they could walk and things like this.
Yeah.
What does Mozart tell us about child prodigy?
Well, I think what Mozart tells us, ironically, is don't be like Mozart, because this may not end well. I mean, if you stop and think about it, the parents look at their kids. It's not the child's fault. It's the parents' fault. These frustrated parents who try to play out their own expectations and personal desires and work that through their children. And as a result, what one fails to notice is that this notion of the child prodigy of today will become tomorrow's genius is a gigantic fallacy, that only the smallest, minutest of fractions of these so-called prodigies ultimately do change the world in significant ways. Yes, many of them end up being successes, and then what's the difference between success and genius? But they are not transformative figures. And by putting these young people in a straitjacket or in an environment in which they are headed only in one direction with one sort of metrics measuring their success, you ultimately end up with failure, and you ultimately end up with dissatisfaction and perhaps dissatisfaction on the part of the parent, and perhaps damage inherent in the child. So we have to be careful about this. The best thing to do is understand that that your prodigy there, the chances of that prodigy becoming a genius are about nil, and you'd be far better off going in a different direction. That's my take studying these prodigies as exemplified by Mozart. Mozart is the one, along with Picasso, for example, the one or two people, they are the exceptions that prove the rule, in a sense. Don't be like Mozart.
So what you found is most of the geniuses you looked at they didn't show these just remarkable aptitude in their youth.
No, that's a funny question, because most of these people were not prodigies. The overwhelming majority were late bloomers. I mean, Van Gogh. How old was he when he actually started painting with oils? 29 years old. Only had a few years to live. Beethoven, how old was he when he wrote his first symphony? He was 30. Shakespeare's greatest plays were written in his 30s. Verdi wrote great operas in the 60s and 70s. Grandma Moses didn't pick up a brush until she was 68. So it turns out that there's, in effect, no statute of limitation for exceptional creativity. We can kind of reach our passion, reach our high spot, high point, almost at any time in life. Perhaps less so in the sciences and more so in the arts.
Now, on that note of age, you do talk about Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, a little bit, and we've covered her on the podcast before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great topic.
But you associate this, what you call childlike imagination, and genius. What's the relationship there?
Well, it's interesting as you look through this, how many of these people, writers, composers, painters, did their best work, in essence, in say, their late teens or their 20s. And then it was downhill thereafter. I think if you look at the works of Picasso, the great stuff, it is absolutely hair-raising, extraordinary, off the charts, amazing, whatever word you want to use. What Picasso painted in about a decade, from 1901 to 1911, when he's in his 20s, all of his great paintings and the stuff that's most valuable today, they were done when he was in his 20s. But even thinking about pop musicians today, you think about the Beatles, you can think about Simon and Garfield, and we could probably go on and on. Kanye West is another person who was very, very young and doing really wonderful things, particularly with regard to his poetry. So there does seem to be this issue that many people, perhaps young people, because they don't see the world exactly like everybody else, they haven't been shoved into a mindset by their parents and by society. They are still very creative. They just see the world differently, or hear the world differently than others. And they're able to capture that other vision, the vision of what might be, the vision of the other world. And as time goes on, and maybe they read works of other people, or people tell them this is how the game is played, they get drawn into a straitjacket, and their creativity disappears. There's a word for this floating around in psychology. It's called neoteny. And I had never heard of it until I started this study.
This is a new one.
You ever heard of that? You ever heard of that?
No, that's new to me as well.
Well, apparently it means, and you can look this up in dictionaries, it means the preservation of youthful creativity and youthful imagination into adulthood, and maybe even into your senescence. So, uh, and that's the trick in a way. If your mind is least fettered in those years, and looking at and just sitting back and studying grandchildren and how they operate, I would be prepared to believe that if your mind is least fettered in these years, that don't lose that. And when parents say to their children, "Oh, grow up," that's the worst thing that, and I was as guilty as the next person. That may be the worst thing you can say if you mean it literally. The best thing to say is don't grow up. Keep that sense of youthful imagination.
I think we all kind of retrospectively wish we had a little bit more of that, because you're right, that does tend to slip away as we get older.
Yeah, yeah, and how to keep it from slipping away. I think it's just be open. It's an overused experience, but overused phrase. But the phrase is be open to experience. Don't get trapped in a particular way of doing business with your life. Get out there, take chances, and it's hard to do during this pandemic. But when it's all over, I came to realize one day, there I am in Manhattan. Love to spend time in Manhattan, and actually some days it's faster to take the subway than it is to take Uber or cab or whatever. So there I am on a subway. I forget what, it may have been the number 3 line going over down to Soho or something like that. And I just started looking around. First of all, I was in Penn Station. Just started looking around. Well, where is all this going? What do all these signs mean? What are all these people coming in here for this direction? And where's that train heading? What happens if I go over to this hallway? Whom will I meet there? Why are the people in this train mostly of people of color? Why are they carrying lunch pails? What does that sign Lafayette mean up there? What is Soho? So what? And on it goes. And you can, just by doing things that you otherwise might not be inclined to do, can teach you a great deal. So and expose you to things that you can then couple with other things and thereby be more creative. So that has a lot to do with it. That's part of it, at least.
One core habit of geniuses that you identify is this curiosity, which we've talked about a little bit, and the idea of being a lifelong learner, no matter how what your age is. How does Leonardo da Vinci kind of embody this spirit of just endless lifelong curiosity?
I guess it just happens, once in a while somebody comes along. I think Einstein was that way too. Didn't Einstein famously say, "I have no great talent. I am simply relentlessly curious." I am relentlessly curious. And that's what Da Vinci was. I think Da Vinci wanted to take apart the world. He wanted to take apart everything. He would climb up to the top of mountains and root around up there in caves and discover, my Lord, these are fossils of bones of fish. Well, what are they doing up here? They should be way down there, 3,000 feet lower from the Apennines. And that causes him to think. He wants to know how this works. So he comes to realize that the Earth is millennia, eons old, and not just 7,000 years, as the Bible told him. He takes machines apart. He takes chemicals apart to see how components are put together to make new kinds of materials that he can paint with. And most challenging of all was that he takes the human body apart to find out how the human body worked. And what he found was radically different than he had been reading in the books from classical antiquity by Galen and other physicians. So he wanted to take the world apart. everything and to see how it worked. And it's hard to say that that was a result of, that probably had to be just, most of it, a lot of it would have to be genetic, because he wasn't given the kind of training. He didn't, he was an illegitimate child. He couldn't even go to the official schools of the time and learn in the official way. Maybe those proved to be a huge advantage, now that I think of it, not being able to go to those schools. He had to go out there and learn it on his own. And once he started learning it on his own, he didn't stop.
So the darker side of genius is we tend to associate, maybe this is from Doc Brown and Back to the Future, but, we tend to associate a genius as maybe being this mad scientist, this mad man with crazy hair. Is there a correlation between these historical geniuses and either, madness, mental illness, or, even rebellious behavior?
Yeah, this is a very interesting idea. And of course, it's an old notion going back to classical antiquity. Aristotle said there's a thin line between genius and insanity. My favorite quote a couple of favorite quotes on this. Charles Dodson, Alice says in Alice in Wonderland, "You're mad, bonkers, completely off your head. But I tell you a secret. All the best people are." And on it goes. Robin Williams said toward the end of his life in an interview, "You are only given a little spot of madness, and if you lose that, you are nothing." But back to the essential question here, statistically, for example, in my book, Hidden Habits of Genius, I investigated in some ways, and sometimes just only superficially, about 100 of these people. And I find out about a third of them have some affective disorder of one sort or another. And we could go through the list: Newton, Beethoven, Lincoln, Sylvia Plath, on and on it goes. Obviously, those that ended their own lives, Van Gogh, Virginia Woolf. So there is a greater incidence. My a very imprecise statistical notion here is about a third of the people in my book suffered, as mentioned, significantly from affective disorders. People in the business, Kay Jamison, for example, Johns Hopkins writes compellingly about this and points out that there is a higher incidence of mental disorder among geniuses, but very little in the sciences. And in a sense, that makes sense, and we could talk about why that might be the case. But it gets dangerously high, assuming that this is a liability. It gets dangerously high with composers, with politicians, with painters, with writers, and particularly the incidence is 40% among poets, whereas with the general population, a rough figure would be about 5 to 10%.
And why might that be? What might it be about the way geniuses see the world that lend themselves to being somewhat, disturbed in their personal lives?
Well, it could be that it's self-selecting. In other words, society has come to view some of these activities as being more accommodating for those who have psychic fluctuations, that it is thought to be okay if you're somewhat disordered, somewhat unbalanced psychically, and be a painter, for example, or a writer. So it may be a self-selection if we get higher numbers to some extent. It also may be that these people intuit, and this gets more to the question, and it's probably the case, these people intuit that psychic disturbance offers a wellspring from which can flow transformative creative ideas. It's a source that can be tapped into. And that's worth thinking about. And that's a very different attitude, I think, than, say, a scientist who has to work logically, step by step within the scientific method, and whose accomplishments can be proven, we think, to be right or wrong through some kind of quantification. The arts generally are not quantifiable, as we all know.
One thing that I found was interesting is that you include an entire chapter on luck. Um, and I don't think in any topic I've ever seen a whole section on just, being lucky. Why did you include that? What does being lucky have to do with being a genius?
Well, it was kind of a chip on my shoulder because I remember having lunch with somebody whose opinion I respected. And I told her I was writing a book on genius. And she sort of laughed and she said, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, genius. I mean, these are just the lucky people. It's all just luck. And I intuited that that's, having done a lot of study, that's not the case, that these geniuses have, as I say, a set of hidden habits, particular personal characteristics that allowed them to accomplish great things. So I started looking more and more at luck, both good and bad. And the takeaway here is, and we've so many people have already said it, I think, going back to Louis Pasteur, fortune favors the prepared mind. He said that in the university address about 1850 in France. Fortune favors the prepared mind. My favorite quote on this, since I'm interested in golf, is what attributed to Gary Player, famous South African golfer, who said, "The more I practice, the luckier I get." Which brings us to the issue of, I guess, what you call situational advantage. And one of the things that I bang on, emphasize in this chapter on luck, is that you can put yourself in a position to be lucky. You can take a lot of chances that other people won't take. Majority of them won't work out, but those few that do might be hitting a home run. So you gotta place yourself in a position to be lucky. Another way of doing this, strangely enough, is to move. And one of the things that I noticed, and I don't think anybody ever really glommed onto this, was that all of these geniuses, with the possible exception of naturalists such as Georgia O'Keeffe as a painter, or Charles Darwin, who needed to get out and around the world to observe things, all of these geniuses moved to one of two places: a metropolitan center, a large city where there is opportunity, and where there is a melding of contrarian opinion, lots of different ideas, or they move to a university where there is an agglomeration of great minds, in theory, agglomeration of great minds, and opportunity there in the form of laboratories and painting studios, music practice rooms, and things such as that. So move either to a metropolitan area or to a university. They all seem to do that. To test themselves against the very best, to be challenged by the very best, and to have the very best opportunities.
One thing that came to mind as I was going through that chapter is, how many potential geniuses have there been in history who, maybe lived in a small, country village somewhere, and didn't have access to other people or resources or ideas, and have just simply faded from the historical record. They could have been very brilliant and very significant.
Absolutely. And, this takes us back to the initial question, Kevin. What is genius? Now, I have a rather high lift definition of genius, but supposing we said a genius is the person who has the capacity to come up with a significant idea that will affect a lot of people over a long period of time, but doesn't communicate that. If Einstein were born on a desert island somewhere and just sat there, even though he could think up a new construction for the world, a new theory as to how the universe actually operates, but he didn't have the capacity to communicate that to people, would he still be a genius? Supposing he'd communicated that to people and they didn't want to listen, would he still have been a genius? But it's an interesting question. You could say, yes, Einstein, because he could have thought of that. He thought of that and he just stayed there in his little town and never told anybody, or on his island, never told anybody. He's still a genius, but we've just never heard of him. So it's almost a philosophical question in a way. If the genius creates on the desert island, does he or she still create?
The tree falls in the middle of the woods.
Yeah, there we are. Yeah.
So, for those of us, non-geniuses, what,
including myself, the plotters.
But
that's why I loved Amadeus. The last scene of Amadeus, it's not, that movie is about Mozart to some degree, but it's about genius. And he says he's going out of the asylum and he's giving a benediction, actually an aspergus. My blessings to all mediocres. My blessings to all mediocres. And that's what the vast majority of us are, just those mediocres, and we need all the help we can get.
We do. It's true. So what can we get from them by studying their lives and looking at how they structure their day and the things that they cared about? What can we glean from these geniuses' lives that can benefit us?
There are a lot of things to think about. There's a lot to think about how we can be more creative in our own lives, or more importantly, and it's a question we might want to address at some point, how the whole notion of what is genius? Is it not implicitly inegalitarian? Is it not implicitly elitist? What do we do with the so-called gifted? How does this play out in our educational systems, both within school buildings and at home? These are very interesting issues. But there are really two things: how we almost selfishly and individually can deal with this, what takeaways there are from the book in that way, and what are the implications there are for youngsters and how they should be educated and how they should be treated by parents.
Well, what are some personal habits of theirs that, someone listening to the podcast could maybe start employing in their life? For example, listening to history podcasts and being
absolutely get out there. There's so many things. You have no excuse today. You've got none of us has an excuse. We got the whole internet there. We've got these great courses put out there by Coursera and edX, and you can follow those for free around the world. The very best education is for free all around the world. So we can get out there and do that. And as we've talked about, we can also be not averse to, be open to experience just getting out and about the world. Get out there and don't be afraid if you're lost. The best thing that can happen to you would be to get out and be lost, no matter what your age. The older you get and you get lost, people are nice to you and they help you. they help you out. So there are things we can do to be creative, and this was one of the real shockers for me in the book, that that these geniuses. I always thought geniuses are always lucubrating. They're thinking all the time. In point of fact, oftentimes they figured out that the best way to come up with an original creative idea is to just relax and try not to think. But that's a whole sort of side issue about relaxation, where you should relax, where you should go, what you should do when you're relaxing, and how this plays out, and how many great minds over the centuries have experienced insightful, or have experienced insights when they were asleep or immediately after waking from sleep, or in the shower, and off we can go.
Archimedes in the bathtub.
So yeah, and goes all the way back to Archimedes. Eureka! I've got it. He figured out. He didn't figure it out while he's sitting at his desk. He figured it out while relaxing in a bathtub. And so many people over the centuries have said pretty much the same thing. The other interesting thing about, we were talking about what not to do, or what are the takeaways are, some things not to do. And I say this watching youngsters. Had a wonderful Zoom conference just last night with 3 grandchildren and their parents talking about their educations, ages 12, 14, and 16 now. And what is important and what is not important. And I'm a bit of a contrarian here, having done this research and watched these geniuses. I think, and I have opinions radically different than I had when I started out. I thought the most important thing was a high score, get in there, study for your SATs, get straight A's, get into, Yale Phi Beta Kappa, and all of this stuff. That turns out to be hugely overrated. There are other things that should be emphasized, but it's not necessarily the things that we would think of as the markers for exceptional performance for a young person today.
All right. Well, Craig Wright, this has been a lot of fun to talk about. I very much enjoyed reading your book. The book, again, is The Hidden Habits of Genius. For those listening, if they wanted to learn more about you or pick up a copy of the book, where can they go?
Go to, it seems a bit self-serving, but you can go to Amazon, and if you just put in the search box there, Craig Wright Genius, up will come the book. And I'm sorry about that. It implies that I'm a genius. But as I've issued multiple disclaimers here today. But again, it's go to Amazon, Craig Wright Genius. And thanks for inviting me.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Can't Make This Up History podcast. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Craig Wright about the subject of geniuses. If you were intrigued by this, and you have become curious, as we talked about today, and you would like to get a copy of Craig's book, I have provided a link to his book down in your description in your podcast app. That will take you to a website called indiebound.org, and it'll put you in touch with your nearest local bookstore so you can get a copy of Hidden Habits of Genius. One more thing for today. I'd like to give a shout out to the Straight Up Strange podcast network that this show is a part of. There's a lot of interesting shows on the network dealing with history, folklore, mythology, paranormal stuff. And there is a lot in there that is perfect for the month of October. If you are getting in a spooky mood with Halloween coming up, there is tons of stuff on Straight Up Strange for you to listen to. All right, that's it for me. Next time you hear from me, we will be diving into World War II to speak with a World War II veteran who marched with General Patton. See you then.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.